Good afternoon and welcome to the Hicomply webinar. Today we'll be looking at how a business can start the journey towards information security, and in particular through the implementation of the ISO IEC 27001 framework. But before we get started, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Ed Bartlett, the CEO and co-founder of Hicomply, and I'm delighted to see so many people here today and look forward to the live Q&A after the presentation. So maybe the first place to start is to look at where we are as an industry, and where cyber and information security has got to in the last year or two. It's fair to say cybersecurity is a space that relies on fear to create action. Very much a big stick approach. There's always a guy in a hoodie looking to steal your data, hack your business. There's always a threat of fines. And fair to say that we can't ignore information security. We need to do something about it. And it's very much the case that the risks associated with cyber are ever increasing, and the financial impact and damage that they might cause is ever increasing. And the reputational damage of things going wrong is ever increasing. The legal frameworks and the governance frameworks that have been established are all focused on reducing and understanding cyber risks even further. But there is a flip side, and with a big stick approach, the opposite approach is always the carrot. And I think I'm going to take a little bit of a look first at the alternative angle before we get into the ISO framework. So the carrot, or the pogo stick in this case, what I'd like to really introduce here is the positive incentive for businesses to do something about information security. And the first of these is without doubt the competitive advantage that this can give a business. Probably 80% of the businesses that we talk to are focused on how they can acquire more customers through having a better security posture. And this comes out through questionnaires in tenders, qualification for RFPs, and it's very much a differentiator in a market where enterprise customers in particular, their needs are increasing in terms of cyber and information security, and they're passing that down to their supply chain. So as a supply chain provider of a service or a product or a solution, it's where we can gain a competitive advantage. And certainly, in my own experience, thinking back to how my journey started towards information security back in 2011, I was the co-founder of a business called Hicomply. And the CTO and co-founder of that business, Nick Graham, had implemented a security framework 27001 at a previous business, and we were planning on how we were going to grow the business, how we were going to scale that business. And this is back when we had probably no more than 5 staff, and we had a long conversation and debate about at that stage committing the time and resources to gaining security certification. I wasn't that convinced at the time, I have to say. It felt complicated, it felt time consuming, but we went ahead with that strategy. And the second customer that we were able to acquire after getting our business certified was a significant value customer, government enterprise customer, and that one contract was transformational for that business. And we were able to qualify for other government frameworks like the government G-Cloud framework. And it really opened my eyes to the competitive advantage that it was providing. And at the time, this is back in, say, 2013, 14 even, it wasn't really seen as something that a particularly young technology business would even think about. So we saw the benefit, but we did also see the complications and the time and effort involved in achieving that certification. And that's really where the idea for Hicomply was born. But it's not just about tenders, it's also about being able to access new markets, new sectors, and new geographies where perhaps information security is more focused or more heavyweight in terms of what customers are looking for. But it can also improve customer retention, in that building that framework, that information security framework, can mean that customers aren't exposed to breaches and problems, and ultimately customers will stay with you if they feel secure. On top of the sort of sales and competitive side of things, we are increasingly seeing benefits come through what I call strategic business benefits. And what we're talking about here is making your business more attractive to investors, and improving your ability to raise capital and raise investment. And certainly we've seen that raising capital ourselves, that your investors are traditionally may have looked at your finances, may have looked at your HR and your IP, intellectual property, but maybe in the past didn't go as far as looking at the detail around information security, whereas investors today will ask those difficult questions. And if your IT platform, your systems, your processes aren't robust, it will be something that is exposed during a funding or an acquisition process. And we talked a little bit about risk already, but certainly, really what we're talking about here is being able to demonstrate that you can secure your own business data, but also your customers' data, and build that trust between yourself and your customers. And ultimately that will reduce the likelihood of data breaches, fines, protecting your own information assets, but also those of your customer. And feeding on from that, that strong culture of understanding around information security will ultimately give you a business that is more attractive to your employees, and also retaining staff. And I think it's become a real clear litmus test for employees looking at their business and saying, how secure, how credible is the business that I work for, how seriously does this business take information security? And I think these things are without doubt on the agenda of people looking at opportunities, and in an ever increasing competitive environment where the best people are difficult to find and hire and retain. These are things that we can do to make a difference. And these aren't about the information security protocol itself or the framework. This is about how you embody that into your business, how you take it seriously, and ultimately it becomes a measure of that seriousness and that posture that you display both internally and externally as a business. So, having said all that, how do you go about putting something in place? And we would always, every time, look to the gold standard in information security, which is achieving ISO 27001 accreditation. It's the gold standard in many ways because it's it's international in its reach, but secondly, it has embodied many developments up until its first release in 2000. The latest standard was released in 2013. And in fact, a new version of the standard is due this year, and we'll touch on that later, probably in the Q&A. But this standard is one that any business can get hold of, and any business can implement in a relatively cost-effective and reasonable time frame if the right approach is taken. And what I mean by that is understanding how you go about developing the framework. And we have 10 steps which we're going to talk through today. But really we're talking about, firstly, it's about getting the right people, picking your squad in terms of how, the people who are going to drive this through your organization. Understanding what an information security management system is and how it should be scoped to be relevant to your organization, because every business is different. Every organization has different information security risks and opportunities. So once you've looked at the scope and how it's relevant, you move into a phase of developing your asset registers, identifying the information assets that your business owns and what you want to protect. You then move into doing risk assessment and risk treatment and risk remediation, which is a critical and probably the least understood part of the process. And this is something that we've worked hard at simplifying and automating, and it's something we'll touch on later. And then the policies and procedures that the business wants to implement, and under ISO 27001, there are mandatory policies and procedures, and there are additional policies and procedures that you might want to implement as a business. So it's a case of building that policy and procedure framework, and again, that's something that we've found can be automated and streamlined significantly, saving significant amounts of time and effort. And step 6, you're moving into the development of the statement of applicability. And the statement of applicability is really where, against the controls within the ISO standard, you set out how those controls are applicable to the business and how they will be monitored over time. And then once you've established that statement of applicability, you move into monitoring and preparation phase, preparing the business for the internal audit, which will typically something that is done can be done with your own team, but by somebody who's got an independent perspective. And then moving through into learnings from the internal audit will by far steer you towards the final stage of the external audit. But in between the internal audit and the external audit, there's a need to monitor the business, collect the relevant evidence, so that when you come to that audit, you've got a clear and documented set of evidence, controls, documentation to demonstrate to a third-party independent auditor that the business has implemented the standard and secondly is taking it seriously, because ultimately it's not just about implementing the standard, it's how you live and breathe the standard over time. So what we're going to do now is move into a brief overview of each of these steps and move forward through to a Q&A session afterwards. So taking the first stage of the framework, we're very much focused on people and picking the right squad. The standard is pretty specific in that, as a business, you should look to define the correct, sufficient resources to implement, maintain, and improve the information security management system over time. The size of that team and the number of people will very much depend on the size of the organization. It's typically, the team structures are built along the lines of your existing business framework, so your engineering team, customer services team, commercial team, etc. A relatively small technology business would be able to manage this process with a couple of key members of the team, supported by departmental heads as and when required. So it really does depend on the size of the organization. But another key thing to consider is the standard isn't just about one or two people driving the process. It's also about getting in place whole business compliance. And by that, there is a requirement for a wide-ranging group of people in the organization to review key documentation and demonstrate compliance against policies and procedures that you need to roll out across that business. And it's important that the ISMS can be accessed and available to potentially everybody in the organization. And that's something that can be a real barrier when trying to do this in a sort of traditional sort of document-driven environment. It's also important to think about identifying both your internal and your external auditors very early in the process. Certainly, external audit bodies can need a couple of months' notice to be ready to come in and do those audits, and it's something that we have seen in the past organisations leaving that till too late in the process, and then seeing delay when they're actually ready to go to audit. So that's something that we can support organisations with as well. So picking the right team, first step. Second step is all about the scope, and the ISMS scope itself is where an organisation will determine, the relevance and the scope of the information security management system to be deployed. You would record, the basic. There's some fundamental minimum requirements of the scope. For example, identifying internal and external issues, requirements of interested parties, dependencies, any interfaces. If you outsource key information services or services that mean your intellectual property or information assets are passed over between different organizations. But fundamentally, it's about determining how the standard is relevant and where it's relevant, and what you determine is relevant and in scope. Ultimately, no matter where or how or by whom this information is accessed, it becomes something that must be protected under the scope of the standard, and through the information security processes that you develop. It's fairly critical that the scope also takes account of latest legislation, which is a constantly moving area to address, and certainly it's something that we have automated in terms of giving our customers an easy and step-by-step workflow-based approach to building the scope. And it's something that we find that organizations can do on their own without very specialist advice, and it's something that often engenders interest, and it's something that actually gets the whole team motivated, and it's also at that time you would start to look at the planning and timelines, and the process in terms of what your objectives are, in terms of when do we want to achieve certification by. The third step is about assets, and assets by definition can mean many different things to many different people, but in the context of an information security management system, it's about identifying assets that are relevant in terms of assets that hold information or intellectual property, or assets that have an impact on those assets. So it can be a primary asset, which might be the client data you hold on behalf of your customers, but you also have some physical assets such as access control systems and network control, things such as that have an impact on how those primary assets are protected. The asset register process is well documented in the standard under Annex A8, and critically, the asset management process is about first building an asset register, and then determining ownership, responsibility, classifying the assets, addressing where assets are involved in media handling, where those assets exist, where they live, and it's something that we've seen best tackled through a level of automation. So we've built libraries of the most typical assets found in different types of organizations, and streamlined the building of that asset register, which can be quite a time-consuming process. Most organizations hold an asset register in an Excel spreadsheet. We find that it's much more effective to build that asset register in a linked way, so that the assets don't live on their own. They're actually linked to the risk register, they're linked to policies and procedures, they're linked into the scope of the ISMS itself. So once the asset register is built, we're then looking at the risk assessment and risk treatment processes and individual tasks within an ISMS. And fundamentally, risk assessment is a must-do under an ISMS, particularly the ISO standard. The requirements are quite well documented, probably one of the most heavily documented areas within the standard under clause 8.2.8.3 and clause 6.1. And the standard sets out a requirement for the risk assessment process itself, how you go about looking at an asset that we've just touched on, what are the vulnerabilities, the threats, and the actions associated with remediating those risks. So it's about the risk assessment and the treatment of those risks, but also how you address those. And it's also critical that the process is fully documented, both in terms of the, as you can see in this example on the screen, we've got an example of a risk register where we have the risk profile before treatment and after treatment, and using this 5x5 grid. So you've got assets that are low impact, low probability, and those that are high impact, high probability. And the idea is to move your reds through the risk treatment process, move your reds down to amber or green if you can. And if a risk is not something that can be moved to red, and there always are risks that will remain red, it's about how you manage those risks, and how you put in place policies and procedures associated with that. And that takes us quite nicely on to that next phase, step 5, where the policies and procedures are put in place to help the business manage and implement the ISMS, but also the guidance, the reference points. This is the how-to element of the standard, and it's very much about addressing the documented information required under an ISMS, but it's also about making it part of the business. And this is where, through evidence and the monitoring phase, a business will be expected to demonstrate that not only have you implemented a policy or procedure, but that you're living by it and you're using it, and it's being implemented into your day-to-day business processes, which is really critical. Under the standard, there are 15 mandatory policies and 13 mandatory procedures. So, as a minimum, 28 policy and procedure documents. On top of that, there are additional record documents, associated records that will need to be collected. And really critical here is the control and sign-off process. And really, an automated framework, a platform really comes into its own here. We're talking about, document management on quite a large scale. We're talking about information points, say, for example, that you picked up in your scope that need to be cascaded through all of your policies and procedures. And we've seen that by automating the library creation, but also the edit and update and maintenance of policies and procedures is something that can easily save an organization £20,000-30,000 a year in cost alone. And also worth highlighting that the documentation is alive, and there'll always be specific policies and procedures that you may want to add, and our approach has been to give our customers a ready-made sort of industry expert written set of documentation. And we found that a lot of documentation, policies and procedures that you can buy off the shelf certainly often require a lot of customization, a lot of rewriting, and often are overly complex and not particularly well written. So I think, one little sort of flag would be, whatever process or system you adopt, just take a look at a few of the policies and procedures and just look at how usable, readable, how easy they would be to implement in your organization as a bit of a litmus test, or a bit of a way of assessing the relevance of that approach to your organization. And then we're looking at how we take on all the steps we've just been through. How do we make them applicable? And this is really where we implement the statement of applicability. The statement of applicability is where you will implement the information security controls set out under the Annex A of the standard. There are 114 controls, and each of them referenced, clause referenced. And it's really the link between the risk assessment work you've done and the treatment that you have said the business will apply. So this is how really you make the outcome of the risk assessment come to life, but it's also how you manage and control the applicability of the standard throughout the 3-year typical life cycle of achieving the standard and being recertified. And this is something that will be critical to the audit and also critical to demonstrating to external audit that the standard has been properly implemented. Our approach has been to give onboard guidance, a workflow that takes the user through each of the controls, the objective of the control, whether it's, you determine whether it's applicable, but with guidance to help you understand, what is the objective of the control? Because if you don't understand the objective first, you wouldn't necessarily know if it was applicable. And also the justification of, and the description of any controls that you put in place. And ultimately, by implementing this SOA, there'll be a series of tasks and follow-on activities that will come out of the process, and that's really what is then monitored over time. And it's this phase of monitoring and preparation, and it's important to consider that typically we're talking here about a program of work over a year, and sort of an end-to-end process. You under the standard itself, there is a procedure that you would develop that determines what tasks that you'll undertake. What weekly activities, what monthly activities, what quarterly activities. For example, you would typically have an information security management forum to be conducted on a regular interval. Typically on a monthly basis at least. You would be documenting the outcome from those forums. You'd be undertaking access control reviews, supply chain reviews, and in all cases, the results would be documented. But it would be important to have a clear plan of what tasks are going to be implemented over the period that you're looking. Again, these are things that would be implemented in the run-up to an internal audit, but they would then roll over to being the day-to-day management tasks going forward. And we often get asked by customers, okay, how much work's involved after you've been certified, in terms of maintenance of the standard versus the first year of activity. And it's fair to say that these ongoing tasks will repeat year 2, year 3. But it's important to think about how these can be efficiently managed, and this is a critical part of our approach. It's looking to task manage out all of the steps of the process from day one, and manage those through user-friendly task engines, through Gantt charts, links to the diary, links to required reading, all of that sort of thing, so that everybody in the organization knows what they're going to be doing on a weekly, monthly, quarterly, biannual basis, and everybody's fully aware of their role and their responsibility in that process. So once that monitoring initial task phase has been implemented, we're really talking about step 8. We're talking about the internal audit, and this is where under the standard, the requirements of the internal audit set out in the clause 9.2. Critically, they need to be conducted at planned intervals. We would, as I've just mentioned, we would automate the auditing schedule out in advance. Critical, they need to be objective, impartial, and the criteria of the scope would need to be determined before. So based on the scope and the outcome of the schedule, statement of applicability, the audit scope would be determined. And our model is to, again, in a very similar way to the SOA, we are looking at each stage of the audit, giving clear, real-time updates in terms of where the organization is in terms of their status, what the objectives are of, for example, here looking at 8.2, information security risk assessment. What is the objective of that requirement under the standard, the control? What guidance are we giving to the management team, the organization, in terms of how they respond to that? And then it's a case of the findings and tasks being logged through that process. But providing an organization with a user-friendly management tool where they can set out the requirements of the audit and undertake the audit is a huge benefit. It's a huge time saver, and ultimately the outputs of that have to be presented to the external auditor as part of that final process. So the documentation and the collection of that is obviously time stamped. It's gathered over time. So by going through that process, you're collecting the evidence that you will be required at a later stage. And then really we're looking at preparing for the external audit. So in a similar way to the work prior to the internal audit, we're talking about looking at the findings of the internal audit and a remediation plan. So we're saying, okay, what did we find when we undertook that internal audit? What are the observations? Were there any non-conformances, any tasks that need to be undertaken? So really, it's about building an action plan, a remediation plan from the internal audit into a set of follow-on tasks, and again, building those into any updates to any policy and procedures that if they were found lacking. And it's really about business continuity. So it's about how does the organization manage all of the policies and procedures and various processes we've talked about already. And, how do they live and breathe and walk those on an everyday basis? And really that's about critically bringing the business in, and this is where the management team needs to be part of this, because I think often the process is maybe left to one or two people in the technology side of the business or information security team. It's critical at this stage that everybody understands where the business has got to, what are the outcomes of that internal audit that's been undertaken, and what actions need to be undertaken to get the business ready for that very final stage in the process. And everything needs to be documented, and you can see here we've got a visual of our a task schedule. Each of the different colors represents tasks under each of the different strands of the audit, and it's not unusual to have a Kanban like this with various tasks and procedures in place. But the critical thing is they can be monitored. We're talking about having it's a Slack channel or a Teams channel for your ISMS. In effect, it's giving you everything you need in one place, keeping everybody up to speed, and keeping everybody aware of what they need to do. And then really we're talking about audit, and ultimately this is the critical part. It's critical in that it decides on the outcome of whether or not you achieve certification, but if all the previous steps we've talked through, the other 9 steps have been undertaken and organised, often the audit isn't the most difficult part of the process. It should be really a case of an organisation demonstrating that they are operating their information security management system, and the evidence is in place to demonstrate that. And the external audit takes the form of the initial certification audit is a 2-stage audit process, and once an organisation is certified, there are surveillance audits which happen typically on a 12-month cycle thereafter, with a recertification audit happening every 3 years. One thing to bear in mind here is, when you're looking at your providers of external audits, certainly in the UK, the process itself is very similar to the internal audit, but it has to be carried out by an independent certification body. And certainly in the UK, we would always recommend using a UCAS accredited certification body. UCAS itself sits under the IAF, which is the sort of global umbrella accreditation body. And there are a number of certification bodies that you could approach, and we have relationships and worked with many, certainly through our own certification, but also working with customers. And it's important to work with credible organisations, and I think it's important to again, like as I said before, have those conversations early in your life cycle of your ISMS implementation. One little key thing that is not well known in the industry is that since mid 2020, the IAF has said that digital or fully remote audits are now wholly acceptable. It used to be the case that audits had to be physical in nature. Somebody had to physically visit your business, attend meetings at your organization with key people in the same room, reviewing files and documentation. And this change really came about off the back of the COVID pandemic, but also I think would have probably moved forward in any event due to digitization of processes and businesses and remote operation of many, particularly technology businesses. But certainly when we undertook our audits, we worked with Lloyd's Register for our one, and they undertook all of the work they needed to do through remote meetings and remote access through the Hicomply platform. The auditor was given audit user privileges, which limited what they could do in the platform, but it gave them access to the information they needed. They don't typically download information or need to pull information off. They just need to be able to view, see evidence, and see that processes and tasks, policies, procedures, and the like are all in place and have been implemented in the organisation. So that takes us through to step 10, and hopefully a sort of whistle-stop tour of how to build an ISMS in line with the ISO standard. There are going to be certainly more steps and stages for more complex implementations, and just highlighting that if you want to follow up on any of the things we talked about today, we've got some great free resources on our website which you can take a look at hicomply.com. And I will finish by saying thank you, and thank you for attending. Thank you for listening today, and I look forward to your questions. And really, I'd be delighted to work with anybody, follow up on any points. And I'm just going to finish with this: our vision. We see a world where all businesses can and should be able to secure their data, and an environment or a world where businesses are not excluded from markets or geographies due to a lack of customer trust. And ultimately, if we can build that trust between customers and providers, technology, whatever that might be, we'll all be in a more safe and secure business environment. So thank you, and let's hand over for questions. Thank you very much.